Pele leaned in and said something to Freddie.
Don't let them change you. Keep working on what makes you different and what makes you special. It was great advice, but it caused me some problems.
But what could change Freddie Adu?
Soccer is going to explode, and it's going to be around this kid.
We're the Beatles. Everywhere we went, it was the Freddie Show.
And with that came the expectation, and with that came the pressure.
New episodes of American Prodigy drop Tuesdays from Blue Wire Podcasts.
What is crack-a-lackin', Hardwood Knocks listeners? I am Dan Favale, coming at you this time without my co-host, Adam Brommel. We are continuing on with our Loaded podcast, and I will say this one is mega loaded, so I won't waste any time. We're first speaking with Salman Ali. He covers the Houston Rockets for ESPN 97.5 and also hosts the Red Nation Hoops podcast. Follow him on Twitter at Salman Ali NBA. That's at SALMANALI NBA. After we speak with him, we are going to talk with Tara Bowen Biggs about the Portland Trailblazers. She is a co-host of the We Have a Take and Step Back Sisters podcast. Follow her on Twitter at TCBBIGGS. Then, after that, we have a dual podcast with co-hosts, both of them, from the Timeline Pod, which is also hosted by Blue Wire. We have Mike Vigil. Follow him on Twitter at ProtectedPick, spelled exactly as it sounds, and Sam Cooper at SCOOPERHOOPS. We're talking all things Phoenix Suns leading into the regular season. As always, we are putting out a ton of content this pod in total, while there will be timestamps, and I encourage you to jump around. It's running over 4 hours long. That's all I could say. But we're getting to James Harden trades with Salman Ali. We're covering the Suns with Sam and Mike, and then we're talking all things Blazers with Tara. This is going to be a fun one. Please subscribe to us. Download all of our episodes. That's why we're putting out so much content wherever you're getting your podcast. It helps us. Whether or not you're using iTunes, though, please head over there, search Hardwood Knocks, throw us a 5-star rating, write a review, even if it's constructive criticism. We also appreciate that. I will not delay you any further, though. We are going to once again begin Salman Ali to propose many, many James Harden trades. Then it's on to Tara Bowen Biggs. We will talk all things Blazers. And after that, with Sam Cooper and Mike Vigil, we're talking everything and anything Phoenix Suns. Sam, Mike, thank you guys so much for coming on the Hardwood Knocks podcast again. I think both of you, this should be your second appearance. And Mike, this is probably your second appearance within a month. So thank you guys for coming back on. How are you doing today?
Doing well. Thank you for having me. I think last time I was on was such a weird and exciting episode for you and I, because the news about the potential Chris Paul trade broke 10, 15 minutes into the episode. So I'm excited to be back. Who knows what news will break this time?
Yeah, I'm good too. Thanks for bringing me on, Dan. Thanks for bringing both of us on. You didn't even have to choose this time, so hopefully we don't overlap too much.
Yeah, I mean, look, you guys have each been on once, and so I figured I might as well intrude upon both of your weekends. So that made the most sense. And yeah, look, I don't know if this pod can compare to the last one, because listening back, I try to listen to every pod I record again, and that was like just trickling out news like throughout the podcast where Mike and I keep circling back because there's like another Chris Paul tidbit. So if there's something like that to do with the Phoenix Suns, I don't really know what it is, because they have like no real salary to move anymore. But the Phoenix Suns are like, they have to be one of the most polarizing teams now after the Chris Paul trade. And so I'm just, I'll throw it to either of you first. Everyone wants to go first. What was the general impressions of the offseason? And even outside of the CP3 trade, was there like a favorite addition, something that you thought they were still lacking after? It was just such a whirlwind offseason for the Suns. So I'm just curious on your general thoughts of it.
Go ahead, Sam.
Yeah, well, obviously Chris Paul's the headliner here. Outside of him, I think the general impression was an attempt by Monty Williams and James Jones to build on a structure that they already started building last year. They sort of set a system in place where the Suns led the league in assists. And, even though they weren't a fantastic team, it kind of set up this idea of they want every single player to be a good decision maker, roughly, at least relative to their position. They want as many shooters as possible. And so they brought in Chris Paul. Obviously, that's very exciting. He's going to be kind of the engine that makes the entire operation run. But if you look at the rest of their acquisitions, I think some of those this summer are really underrated, bringing in, shooters like Etuan Moore and Langston Galloway. I think even maybe we could talk about their draft selection of Jalen Smith. I know that was a surprise, but I think that There are some underrated traits that he brings to the team. And then Jay Crowder just being my favorite of the bunch as a guy who can shoot, first of all, but also brings defensive toughness. And a real gritty edge that he can add to this defense. So I think the team was just kind of trying to shore up as many weaknesses as possible and confirm to the rest of the world that they are ready for playoff basketball. Now, are they going to be a contender? Maybe not, but they are certainly do look like a roster on paper that is poised for playoff basketball this year.
Yeah, and for me, your listeners know that I've been high on the idea of Chris Paul on the Suns for a while now for culture reasons as well as on the court reasons. But even beyond that, just the idea of Devin Booker playing with shooters on the team is exciting to me. He's never really been surrounded by guys who can consistently shoot really well. Devin Booker was number 1 in potential assists last season. And if you look at that number, potential assists, one of the reasons they weren't assists is because guys really couldn't shoot that well. So I think if you combine him with some shooters going forward, I think his playmaking could improve, but the spacing could improve as well. And he was up towards 70% at the rim last season, and if we can continue that kind of efficiency, beyond Chris Paul, who obviously raises the ceiling, just the guys around him, I think, could help improve Devin Booker and DeAndre Ayton, I think.
They have, it feels like, a lot more functional shooting where Langston Galloway probably more so than Etuan Moore at this point. Like, those are guys who can come around screens. And then I tend to think the idea of Jay Crowder is a lot better than actual Jay Crowder. But
yeah, absolutely.
Just looking at him positionally for them defensively and someone who shot the lights out in Miami, it feels like when he's kind of on better teams, with the exception of LeBron's Cavaliers, that he's going to shoot better anyway. So their offseason was just, for the most part, to me, was just thoroughly good. And I know you mentioned that there's probably not like an obvious way to say that they're contenders, but I feel like when you look at what happened in the West this offseason, where I would say the Lakers definitely got better for the regular season. I'm still not convinced about what they look like for the playoffs if they still have Trez and Schroeder. Like, I'm just not crazy about those fits, but I don't know that any other like really good team got better. The Blazers, I think, are right there. I think you could argue the Mavericks, but I don't trust Kristaps Porzingis' health. The Clippers will be right there, but I think the JaMychal Green loss is going to be tough for them. So I feel like there is sort of a path to the Suns entering that conversation, like at least a feasible one, maybe not a definitive one, and some stuff has to go wrong for other people, but I don't look at this as like just a rock solid playoff team anymore after their offseason and what other teams did. I kind of look at them as like that tier above. Like maybe they're not contenders, but they're not really like, I could see them going for more than like a 6 seed.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I think you go ahead, Mike. Sorry.
Well, I was just going to say to that point, Media Week just happened and they talked about championships. The idea of a championship had been mentioned in Media Week for the Suns for the first time in 11 years, basically. So, I don't know that it's something that you can really figure out yet. This is just such a weird season in general. But to your point, it's not something that they are shying away from, at the very least, talking about as a possibility. So, yeah, I agree.
There's the one question, and I think Mike and I might have talked about this a little bit during the live CP3 reaction pod, whatever that thing ended up being. But what do we think is going to be like the impact that Chris Paul has on Devin Booker? Is it really a matter of we're going to see him have more catch and shoot opportunities and do even more cutting? Or is that increase going to be sort of negligible because they're going to stagger the minutes of these two more so maybe even than they did of Rubio and Booker?
Yeah, I think you're onto something there where they need to stagger them. I think bringing in Rubio last year was really something that allowed Booker to play an increased off-ball role essentially for the first time in his career. His spot-ups went up. You laid out some stats here. His spot-ups went up from 6.8% the previous season to 8.4% of his plays last year with Ricky Rubio. His cuts almost doubled. So I don't know if there's that much more room for that sort of off-ball growth for Devin Booker necessarily. I think there is a little bit. But more so just, the difference between Chris Paul and Ricky Rubio is very clear in terms of Chris Paul can hit a pull-up shot and Ricky Rubio can't. And that's really kind of the beginning and the end of the discussion, I think. So I think staggering those two guys is really going to be what we see a lot more of. And look, maybe jumping ahead of myself here. I think this team has one very obvious Achilles heel that we can kind of get into later in the podcast. But assuming full health and assuming you can have as many lineup combinations as possible, where you get to either have Point Book or Chris Paul leading the show with kind of a bunch of complementary role players, I see no reason why they can't be just like a top offense overall. Like, I think that's going to be a very, very effective strategy. But as for Booker, I think he's going to be kind of in the same sort of realm that he was last year. Some increased off-ball responsibilities, but not necessarily dominating his game in any way.
I think the additions of Etuan Moore and Langston Galloway, instead of trying to find a point guard, probably point to them planning on staggering the minutes a little bit too, because, as good as Cameron Payne was in the bubble, he was out of the NBA before the bubble. So I expect that they're planning on staggering the minutes a lot too. And I think Devin Booker's usage rate went up in the bubble, and I think they found something specific there with him on the ball a little bit more. So I think trying to stagger the minutes a little bit more could be better going forward. It's going to be interesting, though, because it's something that we recorded earlier today for our podcast. It's something that we talked about, too, and there's a little uncertainty on how they're going to handle that and how it's going to look on the court. It's actually kind of hard to predict with these two guys because, something we talked about, and I'd like to hear your thought, Dan. Who of these guys are better? Chris Paul last season, you could point at and you could say Chris Paul was better than Devin Booker. And then a lot of ways you can say Devin Booker will be better than Chris Paul this season because Chris Paul's just getting older. But there's like an element of which of these players is going to be the better player overall. So on the court, who is going to have the ball in their hands more? What's the most effective way to use them? I wonder how you feel about that, Dan.
I think at least in the interim, unless we see a drop-off from Chris Paul, I think the offense is probably better in his hands just because he's going to be the better playmaker for now. And just because, like, what Devin Booker can do, it's not even just his catch and shoots, but he can cut really well. And, like, Chris Paul, just looking at his size and, like, at his age, like, he's not going to do a lot of damage in those situations. So I think when they're playing together, it would be more important for him to have the ball again unless there's, like, a drop-off there. And there's still, like, even if you give Devin Booker like a lion's share control of the offense, maybe there's still a chance that Chris Paul's better overall just because we know what he's going to do on defense. But as of right now, between the two, while Devin Booker has done such a better job as a passer, and while he's lacked like functional shooting and proven shooting around him a lot of the time, I still do feel like in general, Chris Paul is going to be the better option to uplift the offense. And so maybe it's even more important to stagger those minutes sort of heavily so that he can get run with a lot of like the other second unit guys. And you want them to start together and you definitely want them to close together. But I'm just wondering if, and you guys already pointed it out, because of the guards that they signed, I'm just wondering if they plan on like really like staggering. I'm trying to think of like the Mike D'Antoni level where like he separates his guys. And so I'm wondering if it could be like that type of situation, even though their games, as long as they don't have a problem playing off one another because of what both can do off the ball, it feels like they fit together seamlessly.
Yeah, I agree with that. And I think it'll be really interesting going forward. But, it wouldn't surprise me as well if Monty Williams just has a lot of confidence in Cameron Payne. They actually really seem to like him in the bubble. And I think at the very least, I think the beginning of the season, Cameron Payne is going to get some backup point guard minutes, maybe without both of those guys on the floor, just to see how it would work. Because if he can continue to improve where he was at, and it's unsustainable. He shot over 50% from three in the bubble. But if he can still be like relatively good, if he can be like 90% of what he was in the bubble, then you can get away with that a little bit and then just kind of kill teams when both Chris Paul and Devin Booker share the floor together. So I think we'll see, and it will probably change throughout the season what their plans are.
Yeah, that right there, those minutes of Cameron Payne by himself, that's the Achilles heel I was talking about. That's the thing.
It sounds scary.
It is. And Cam did so well in the bubble. He deserved to be brought back. But yeah, the role that they're giving him, that's the one thing for this team. And I know you're going to ask about the guard rotation later. It's just they have so many backup guards who are competent, but actual self-creation is a premium in this league. And getting Chris Paul goes a long way towards adding that. But if either Chris Paul or Devin Booker misses a long stretch of games, you really have to look hard at this roster to find another guy who can kind of create for himself or others.
Well, so let's even just jump to that. So Cameron Payne, I'm guessing, is going to be and you guys talked about this on one of your two previous pods, you did a mailbag, and you said that you would prefer, like, if it's like between 7 and 10 minutes of just that's the limit of no Chris Paul and no Devin Booker at the same time. And so in those minutes, like, I think Cameron Payne is probably the best offensive steward of the four options that they have. So those minutes, he's probably just then the first guard off the bench for them. Is that what you envision?
I think so. I think just his ability to get into the teeth of the defense is better than any of the other guys. For as much as I love Javon Carter, he's not really good with the ball in his hands as far as like creating and penetrating. Cameron Payne is still pretty good at that. And I think if you can match Cameron Payne with a guy like Dario Saric, who's pretty good at creating for others, you can get away with it a little bit more, assuming no Chris Paul and no Devin Booker on the floor. If you're staggering, I think Langston Galloway jumps to the top of that list because Langston Galloway fits really well with both Chris Paul and Devin Booker. But any minutes without both of those two, I think the lead guard at this point has to be Cameron Payne. And it should be said, Monty likes Cameron Payne a lot. He's somebody that he's worked with in the past. He was on the OKC coaching staff when Cameron Payne was there. They seem to have a good relationship. So, as close as he was to sort of retiring, if you will, forcibly retiring, just not getting put onto a roster, he seems to have a good relationship with his coach. So we'll see if that trust sort of translates into the next season. Once they're expected to be good.
I'm glad you brought up Dario Saric there, though, because I do think we need to just quickly say, like, if there was a time to buy Dario Saric stock, I think now is the time to do it because he's going to be given an opportunity to be that guy off the second unit this year, especially if Cam Payne struggles early on. We saw in the bubble, Dario averaged something like, and again, small sample size, but he averaged something like 15 points, 7 rebounds, 3 assists per game. He played his best basketball all season long in Phoenix, and honestly, probably his best basketball since that 1 year in Philly, his sophomore season. There seemed to be a time in his career where he was struggling with the idea of not being a starter, but now that he seems to have bought into it, and he seems to have additionally bought into this idea of even being a 5 in order to sustain his career in the modern era. Like when reporters talked to Dario last week at Media Week, he was just kind of reminiscing about the bubble, saying how awesome it was to play this free-flowing basketball where it just felt like they were going up the court and just making plays, and just everyone was touching the ball, and it felt like everyone had an opportunity to make a meaningful decision with the basketball in their hands. So I think putting him in those sorts of situations in the second unit is really going to be beneficial to the entire team. And he's not going to play a ton of minutes. He's not going to be like a 30-35 minute per game guy, but if he plays 22-25 minutes, like, he has 6th man of the year potential, maybe, like if he puts up those sorts of bubble stats over a long period of time and really becomes the play initiator off that bench.
And so he's then, and this is great that we're like jumping to what I was already going to ask. Is he then the primary backup 5 now? And it seems like that would be the best way to go after he played with the bubble. And also, me being biased, I do not like the Jalen Smith pick in general, whether you want to play him at the 4 or the 5. So it's like, and you have Damian Jones, but like I don't really know what that means unless you think that Chris Paul is really going to uplift him. So if Saric is going to give you like some more shot creation, and he played well with the 5 at the bubble, am I reading this as like, oh, Dario Saric is the backup 5 in Phoenix now?
He definitely should be, and I definitely think it's trending towards that way based on what we saw in the bubble. I can't issue any guarantees. I thought it was interesting. We actually just discovered this yesterday. Mike and I didn't realize the Suns gave Damian Jones a 2-year guaranteed contract. At first, I thought it was just a 1-year vet min. So I don't know if that means something about, oh, they actually intend to play this guy, which for the record, I don't think would be a travesty. I think, if there's one thing Dario doesn't provide off the bench, he's not going to protect the rim. So if you just want a guy to, pick up his 6 fouls and go out there, protect the rim, catch lobs, either Damian Jones or Jalen Smith makes a lot of sense. And I do think those guys are going to soak up some minutes at the 5. But in terms of, is Dario Saric more of a power forward or is he more of a center at this point in his career? I honestly think he's going to log more minutes at center overall than he does at power forward this year. I think most websites, if you go to ESPN or Basketball Reference right now, they're going to call Dario Saric a power forward. But those who really know that he's basically a center at this point.
Yeah, this is my soap. You set up my soapbox pretty nicely there, Dan, because I am everything that Dario Saric is good at is magnified by him playing the 5, and then it gets a little worse if you play him at the 4. His ability to shoot, he's a shooter. He's not a great shooter, but he's a great shooter if you play him at center. Like, he's one of the better shooters who plays at center. If you put him at power forward, what he brings as far as shooting goes down a little bit. But also defensively, he's not super quick laterally. It's almost better that he's guarding bigger guys. He's actually very strong, and that means offensively and defensively. Underrated post game. He's a guy who can push people around, especially off the bench as a center. But also something he really loves to do is pump fake and drive and get into the teeth of the defense. And if there's another guy clogging the spacing for someone like him who's not very fast, it makes it a little harder to take advantage of some of his playmaking. And, for as much as you dislike the Jalen Smith pick, and understandably so, as it's considered a reach, how many big men can shoot off of movement like Jalen Smith coming out of the draft? I think that's one of the reasons they were comfortable picking him. He can still play next to Dario Saric if that's something that they plan on doing. So everything that he's good at is better at the center position. And I'm not super worried about any sort of traditional style rim protection. I think he's a smart defender, but what he brings offensively at the center position will make up for whatever he lacks defensively at that center position. I just think he is a backup center. That's the best version of him.
It's funny that's the case now, because if you go back, like maybe let's say a half decade or 7 years, like he would have been considered this wild mismatch at the 4 spot. And now we've like reached a point where the game is so dynamic that it's someone like Dario Saric who seems like he's made for the 4 is like, no, you know what? He should be the backup 5. And one thing I stumbled across too when I was like doing prep work for this pod was that he was averaging 1.05 points per post-up possession last year and shot over 54% on post-up. So
he's thick. He's like low-key thick.
Yeah, so like if like that's something to work with the second unit, obviously you don't necessarily want it to be a crutch, but if you don't have that, I don't want to say traditional point guard, but let's say like more of a floor general, someone who could really direct people, like having Dario Saric as that bailout option makes so much sense. And look, because you know my thoughts on Jalen Smith, like I absolutely believe that he should be the backup 5. And those lineups, like, yeah, over the course of the season when they were sprinkled in with like the larger sample size, they were fine. But lineups with Dario Saric at the 5 in the bubble were just absolutely murderous. And so like, why wouldn't you just try? And your second unit overall, I would say, is just better, because now I'm assuming, and this will be something we touch upon later, but it's like you're adding Cam Johnson to it basically. Yeah. So it just seems like a no-brainer to continue riding that model. Although I will say something I didn't consider is seeing him and Smith playing together. That's something that would be interesting. I think absolute sieve defensively together. But the one thing that I'll give Jalen Smith is that, and I mentioned this in the chat with you guys, is like his shooting improvement at Maryland seemed real, because as Mike said, like it's functional shooting. Like it wasn't just he was taking a lot of uncork these, like, he had a defender wasn't within 12 feet and he was hitting wide open threes. Like it was real and he was doing stuff. I just don't with Ayton already on the roster. And I think, again, I liked the idea of Tyrese Halliburton, like having Chris Paul as a mentor. And I also just thought with Devin Vassell on the board.
That's who I was going to mention.
Could you have imagined, like, I don't know how often they would have got to this lineup, but like Mikal Bridges, Crowder, and Vassell on the court at the same time?
I know. Yeah, I know, Dan.
I imagined it a lot. Yeah.
But we bought into it. We researched Jalen Smith and we bought into it.
I don't know if I'm fully bought into it yet.
Yeah,
okay, I will say.
Can Sam justify it for me then, please?
Yeah.
No, I can't. Well, here's the truth, Dan. I can't justify it because I know what you want. I understand it's a reach. And for this to be a positive value pick at number 10 overall, we both know he needs to play meaningful minutes at the 4. After having watched him, I can't promise you that. I do think his skills at the 5 are going to be pretty self-evident from the jump. Like just that the rim protection is good. The functional shooting, as you mentioned, if there's anything this team has in spades now, between Devin Booker, Cam Johnson, Langston Galloway, Etuan Moore, Jalen Smith, they've got functional shooting at basically every position. And that's one of the things I'm most excited about. He's also a really good rebounder. Like he's a really good rebounder, Jalen Smith. So I think all of those skills are just going to be very evident. He's going to be able to provide meaningful backup 5 minutes as a rookie if he needs to. And I don't even think he will have to because of Dario Saric. The question is, of course, if he never can play the 4, but does succeed as a 5, let's say he does become like, and this is a random comparison that we've thrown out a couple times. I'm not saying he's going to be like this guy, but let's say he becomes a Miles Turner type eventually one day. Like, let's say that's his ceiling. And he's a starting caliber 5 who protects the rim and hits 3-point shots. Then it brings up the interesting question of, well, what do you do with Deandre Ayton? If those guys can't really coexist, eventually you come to the point where you have to choose one over the other. But yeah, I don't know. I'm excited to see him play at the 4. A little bit nervous about it. Overall, though, I guess my bottom line here is I am excited to be going into a season of Phoenix Suns basketball where the Suns drafted in the lottery, and yet I don't really give a damn about their lottery pick because he just doesn't need to play. He doesn't need to play in order for this to be a good team. And I can't even remember the last time that was the case for this team, that their lottery pick didn't even, he could play 6 or 8 minutes per game and this would still be a good team regardless. So that's not exactly justifying it for you. It's not exactly it's not giving the best pitch for James Jones's strategy, but hey, I will say James Jones marches to his own drum, and for him.
Yeah, Dan, how did you feel about Cameron Johnson? I think that's how a lot of Suns fans are looking at this.
Right, that's a better.
At first, we all looked at Cameron Johnson and said, "What?" And
so
then by
Kobe
the end
White,
of the bubble, it's like
his friend.
He should have gone higher. Maybe
I will say, Dan, if Suns fans can call me out, and they have before, as they should. If you go back to our emergency podcast for the timeline. When we took Cam Johnson, I basically threw a fit right on our podcast, and I've since known not to do that and not to assign too harsh of a judgment to any 19, 20, 21-year-old and Cam Johnson 33-year-old, any of their cases. But so I'll wait and see how he plays first. But I definitely think overall the shooting, the rebounding, the rim protection, these are functional NBA skills that may not necessarily lend themselves to a high ceiling, but absolutely have the potential to impact winning basketball on a rookie contract.
See, my thing is James Jones, has earned the benefit of the James Johnson has earned the benefit of the doubt of nothing. James Jones has earned the benefit of the doubt. But if you're going to take a swing, and this is my argument, like you sort of laid it out for me, is that this rookie didn't need to play big minutes, and so I'm not going to throw a fit because that's part of the reason. But if you're going to take a big swing, I would rather swing at a player that has the potential to turn into something more. And I think if Smith can get by at the 4, okay, that's great, but his value is forever capped if you're invested in Deandre Ayton, as you should be. And I have questions about him coming up. And so I would rather, well, if they're not, I guess I'm not reading the situation correctly then. So now you're really starting to read the tea leaves, Dan. And this is where the conversation is. Look, if you want to use DeAndre Ayton as a trade chip to try and get a third star now, fine. But I would rather, if this is the team, and specifically because it was this 2-year window, which is why I liked Halliburton, is why not have Chris Paul the Suns are obviously hoping this window is longer than that, but with Chris Paul specifically, he's under contract for 2 years. I don't know that you could expect him to play at an all-star level much longer than that. And so having Halliburton just there, and because he didn't need to play, some people wonder if he can be a lead initiator, but just having Chris Paul and even Devin Booker in front of him, I thought felt like such an obvious fit because you didn't need to rely on him. I do think Vassell was more of the it's fine that we don't need him to play, but if you want him to, he seems polished and maybe there's more ball skills there than we thought. So you don't have to draft for fit. I don't see if this is a swing, I don't see the super high upside with Jalen Smith. And if you're not invested in Ayton, I guess that helps a bit, but I'm just looking at him defensively, the rim protection should be fine. And maybe I should look at what Ayton has done over his the improvement from year 1 to year 2 in his defense in space. But the research that I did for Jalen Smith before this pod was just that dude is going to get destroyed in basically every single pick and roll where he's not allowed to camp out just underneath the rim.
Right. Yeah. I think that you're probably right about that. But I do want to ask, Dan, do you buy into the reports about Halliburton asking teams not to draft him? And maybe that shouldn't matter. For the record, I understand the perspective that you don't have to listen to these players, but there were reports that Halliburton was asking teams not to draft him to try and force his way to Sacramento, which, by the way, hilarious to me. But,
sort of I think Jeremy Grant taking equal money to be a member of the Detroit Pistons instead of the Nuggets.
Yeah. do you buy into that, or have you heard anything about that?
I definitely buy into that he was asking it. At the same time, I can't imagine a player asking it with the Kings in mind, is my whole point. And so if the team he actually wanted to go to was the Kings, you take him anyway because it's hey, you're not the Kings. Watch them be a dumpster fire from all the way over here. And I think if he understood, so from what I understand, in Sacramento is that there's going to be like a ton of, I think, more turnovers to come for them. And so maybe he was looking at it as, oh, I know that they're going to move Buddy Hield or that he's going to come off the bench anyway. And so I'll be starting alongside De'Aaron Fox.
Yeah.
You're not going to have that opportunity in Phoenix. So I totally get that. Yeah. I would have taken him anyway. And so like, I'll never, like if I was Philly, when KP didn't want to go there, they were already collecting bigs. I would have taken him anyway instead of Jahlil for whatever that draft ended up being. So I totally get that. Sam's point makes sense. And again, if you're doubting like maybe how committed the Suns are to Ayton, or if they just want to keep their options open at the 5, I just don't see Smith like being a high enough upside swing to justify the swing itself.
Because first of all, I agree with you. I think, you were talking about his ability to defend at space. He's not the athlete Deandre Ayton is by any stretch of the imagination. And because Suns fans are listening to this, I feel the need to emphasize for the millionth time, I'm not saying I want the Suns to trade Deandre Ayton. I just think if there's anything we know about James Jones at this point, it's that he moves in silence.
Right.
he's one of those GMs, like he is not afraid of going in the complete opposite direction of the popular opinion. And he has shown absolutely no loyalty to any Ryan McDonough era player who was a leftover on the roster outside of Devin Booker, who he obviously believes in Devin Booker as a superstar player. But DeAndre Ayton was not his pick. And I think DeAndre Ayton is a very talented prospect. I think he has a high ceiling, could be an all-NBA center for many years to come. But if James Jones feels that moving him is what can get him the third star that will build out his vision, and Jalen Smith can be the starting center instead, it would not, knowing what we know about James Jones now, it would not surprise me one bit. That's all I'll say. It's not to say DeAndre Ayton's a bad player. It's just James Jones does whatever the hell he wants, and he does not care what we have to say about it.
And I do think that's probably something I didn't consider because Ayton's actually good. This is normally like with like fringe guys where you don't know that these regimes, these front office regimes, like they want their own guys in there. So I guess that's something I didn't consider enough, but I don't know. I'm still just uneasy about the pick, and like I'm wrong about the draft all the time. So maybe I just co-signed like a really strong career for Jalen Smith. Congratulations to him. But just the options on the board, it seemed like there were too many no-brainers. But is that the feel that you guys are getting then? Like, is this? And I'm not saying that we need to infer that it means anything other than they really like Jalen Smith. But do you think that this type of pick does leave it into question of how committed they are to Ayton, or maybe they're just worried that he doesn't want to be? They've set the table now where he's never going to be higher than the third option with Paul and Booker there. And so is there really anything potentially more underlying there?
Personally, for me, it has nothing to do with the pick. I mean, maybe you can add that onto a pile of evidence, but to me, as soon as Chris Paul was willing to play for the Suns, I think he's doing that for Devin Booker specifically. And then the understanding of James Jones saying, if there's something to be done, a move to be made that could bring us closer to a championship, I am willing to make it. I don't know that Chris Paul would be willing to play for the Suns without some sort of understanding there. And, it's a tough conversation. I think, like Sam pointed out, that Suns fans are listening. It's a tough conversation there because a lot of them are attached to DeAndre Ayton. And I'm not even necessarily specifically talking about DeAndre Ayton. I just mean when Chris Paul agrees to come to the Suns, he's looking at it as me and a offensive superstar in Devin Booker. Can I find a path to a championship with the assets that they now have? And exactly. I just very much doubt that Chris Paul would be willing to play for a team like the Suns without some sort of understanding from James Jones that if there's a move to be made, they'd be willing to do it. So the pick, way you could point at the pick as more evidence of that, but I don't. I thought that before they even made that pick.
I know we're a couple of years into DeAndre Ayton's career now, so it's not a perfect comparison. But the way I've heard you put it before, Mike, is LeBron didn't go back to Cleveland to play with Andrew Wiggins.
Yeah.
So whatever puts Chris Paul in position to win a championship, again, neither of us is saying DeAndre Ayton's a bad player. We haven't even really had an extended conversation here about him on this pod. I mean, I think he's a terrific, terrific player and really makes the team stronger in their pursuit of home court advantage this year. But James Jones does what he wants. And if he sees a better deal out there, I wouldn't doubt it for a second.
Whew, that you guys gave me something to think about that I did not consider. He instantly becomes, if they were willing to move him, like a super valuable trade asset. I don't necessarily know the player that like you would deal him for, because I don't know that Bradley Beal makes too much sense for this team, even though Ayton makes a ton of sense for the Wizards if they really wanted to rebuild at some point this season. But there's always, I guess, another star out there.
Yeah, you never know.
Yeah, but with Ayton, so let's assume that he stays. What does his fit look like next to now Maybe it helps that they will be staggering CP3 and Booker so much, so he's playing with only one of them a bunch. But what does his role look like next to the two of them? Is it sort of a matter of we're just going to see him exchanging the post-ups, a lot of the post-ups he had last year, for just more dives?
I hope so. I really hope so. I think I talked about it on the podcast we just recorded too. Deandre Ayton as your second best player has a specific kind of ceiling. Deandre Ayton as your third best player has a much higher ceiling. I think if you look at that team from that perspective, with two genuine offensive superstars on the team, Deandre Ayton has to understand that his role is now to fit with those two offensive superstars. And that means rolling to the rim hard and a lot. That does not mean demanding the ball in the block. And I will say, to Deandre Ayton's credit, sometimes you looked at him last season and you thought, just ask for the ball, demand the ball, in that post and go to work. And he doesn't do that. And last season, you might look at that as a negative. This season, with Chris Paul on the team, you might actually look at that as something that is good for this team, because now you just have to get him in the right mindset to continually roll to the rim. And I think it's particularly important to understand that it does not matter if he gets the ball on that roll. He will be a decoy commonly for shooters, for the mid-range shots, for two of the best mid-range shooters in the NBA are now on this team in Chris Paul and Devin Booker. And now that there's legitimate shooting on the outside that they can put, he has to understand that it's not always necessarily going to be for him getting the ball. We've started to call it on our podcast a roll assist, rolling to the basket to get other guys open, and then those shots can go in. And so I really do hope. First of all, I don't like the mid-range shots. Those need to go, and I think they probably will, because there's another guy that's going to eat up that mid-range space now, the best mid-range shooter in the NBA probably, in Chris Paul. And then I'm not a huge fan of the post-ups other than mismatches. I think it's fine if you can post up on mismatches and switches, but I'd like to eliminate those almost entirely in favor of just sort of being one of the better role men in the league, and emphasizing his defensive role. That's the important part at this point.
Absolutely. Defense is going to be key for DeAndre. Offensively, look, the honest truth is that Deandre Ayton is really only great at one thing on offense right now, and that's being a lob threat. He's got a ton of gravity, and if you're just trying to build the best possible team for next year and aren't as worried about developing him into a high-level all-NBA first-team center, then you basically treat him as Rudy Gobert on offense next year and just say catch lobs. And he could be very, very good at it, and he might only average 16 or 17 points per game, but it might be the best thing to make the Suns the best offensive team next year. Defensively, this is CP3 is going to be on his ass all season long about defense. And the thing is, DeAndre Ayton is a good defender now. Like, people didn't see it in year one, and that was fair because he was a bad defender. I'm very confident now in saying he's a good defender. He just has these small tweaks to make to become a great defender. And I'll give you one example. Here's one stat that surprised me that I actually sought out about Ayton the other day. DeAndre Ayton led the league among all centers in contested three-point shots per game. He contested 5.1 threes per game last season. Nobody else even came close. Anthony Davis was actually second at 4.2, a full three less per game. And the reason that's important is because year one, DeAndre Ayton was basically a drop defender. I mean, he would switch sometimes on some select matchups, but he was mostly in drop coverage schemes. And even there, he struggled as a rim protector. Year two, he basically doubled his block rate. We saw him make huge strides as a drop defender. And even despite that, though, Monty Williams grew much, much more comfortable in deploying him in traps and playing him up high and switching him onto guards and having him contest just a larger amount of threes per game. So he's like, this is the reason he was drafted, is to be this kind of malleable defender who can see different pick and roll coverages and play very well in space. And he's very, very good at all of that stuff. To take the next step and become like an all defense level player or a defensive player of the year contender, it's just about off ball engagement, communication, like shoring up his reaction time to the point of rotating to the right place before a breakdown can even happen. And so hopefully, I think Aaron Baines was a great veteran to have behind him last year, because hopefully he learned something from Aaron Baines about just communicating and calling out sets and coverages. Mm-hmm. And I think Chris Paul is going to be that veteran who's really going to be on his case this year about, we know you're athletic. We know you can move and keep up with other guys and be a great on-ball defender, but we need you to anchor this entire system. And that means really looking out for the rest of your teammates as well from that position.
it's probably important to have that type of voice, even though I know Chris Paul has been considered grading in the past, just because I don't know if Ayton would be this type of player, but like defensive effort and engagement will suffer if his offensive role is at all, like if he's just being used more as a decoy and the touches are down, and are they even going to be willing to try and get him his own post touches? Like maybe that's something you can go to in the no Booker, no CP3 minutes, though again I wouldn't recommend it. So having Chris Paul there, I mean, it's going to be good for everybody, but if you're actually, there's a chance that Ayton's role might be like the largest impacted on offense of all these guys. It's probably important to have a voice like that on the defensive end.
Yeah, and it should be said that like the Suns have two guys that can get him the ball on the rolls still. Like I do think he can get close to 20 points a game just from being that role man. I don't like, I wasn't a huge fan of the post ups anyway. And if you throw in a combination of the willingness to shoot the 3-pointer when it's wide open, and two guys who are like some of the better guys in the league at getting the ball to guys on the roll, I still think he could have a pretty strong offensive impact on this team without, 75% of his, I just went over this stat too, 75% of his shots basically were assisted last season, and that is fine if it stays that way this season. If you factor in some of those unassisted shots as offensive putbacks, rebounds into putbacks, then it's fine. If that stays the same, I still think he can get more more shots on the rim with the shooting and with the guys that are on the team now. For me, offensively, he needs to get better at just being willing to take contact and getting those free throw attempts up, because it's kind of pathetic for what he is. As far as it really is, he needs to get to the free throw line more. And if he can do that, that'll increase his points pretty easily too, because he's a legitimately good free throw shooter. But the Suns last year, by the way, best free throw shooting team of all time. Kind of an interesting stat.
Did not know that.
Yeah, it's a very, very underutilized stat that like Suns Twitter has latched onto. I did a whole in the bubble because they had to gain on other teams in the bubble, which I think is interesting because they shot like 90% from the free throw line in the bubble, probably because there were no fans. And then so they had to catch up to the other teams, and I did a whole free throw watch on Twitter, but never really caught on nationally.
We've already established that clearly Deandre Ayton's not finishing the season in Phoenix, so we can move on from that.
We're going to lose all our followers on Twitter now.
This is my contractually obligated question. I'll throw it to Sam just because Mike and I already talked about this. Well, I guess not this specifically, but does CP3's arrival ensure that Mikal Bridges now just gets it together more on offense? Because it's like the shots he's going to have, he's not going to be able to pass them up, and the space that he's going to be able to attack now, off the catch, I would assume it's just going to be so much more wide open that I'm wondering if Chris Paul benefits, just having both Chris Paul and Devin Booker there benefits him from the standpoint of, hey, we kind of saw him play really well towards the end of the year on offense, but this ensures that he'll do it more consistently.
Look, Ricky Rubio was already a great partner for Mikhail Bridges to have, so I definitely don't want to overstate it, because it's not like the Suns upgrading from Isaiah Canaan to Ricky Rubio, which is what they did last year, but there is still an upgrade there just from Chris Paul with his gravity in the mid-range sucking in. Mikhail Bridges was one of the best cutters in the NBA last season, and this is just a super smart role player who does not take dumb mid-range shots. And what we saw from him last year was he fills the lane properly in transition. He makes smart cuts, and I think he's going to continue to benefit from that in a system that revolves around Chris Paul and Devin Booker. Now, does that lend itself to, 15, 16 points per game? I don't really think it does. But I definitely think he can go up from, he averaged 9 points per game last year. I think he can get up to the 11, 12, maybe 13 range this year, just as a super smart, savvy role player who basically only takes smart shots. And hopefully the other thing we're hoping for, obviously, is he kind of finally fixed his 3-point jumper there at the end of last year. It was a little bit less wonky, to the point where he shot 36%.
He had a couple
on the
pull-ups
season
too,
overall.
that caught me off guard.
Yeah, he did. And look, it's Mikal Bridges. He's just an amazing defensive player. Anything you can get on offense is basically a bonus. So we're not expecting some pull-up maestro to come out of him all of a sudden, as awesome as that would be. But if he can just get up to 38, 39%, not even necessarily his Villanova percentages, but just a solid, close to 40%, become a true 3-and-D role player in every essence of the word. Who also is just a very good cutter, as I said. I mean, it's a Swiss Army knife. And for that type of player to be essentially the 4th or 5th option in your starting lineup, is what makes this team such a dangerous offense in the first place. It's the fact that, Chris Paul, Devin Booker are going to be the engine. Everyone else is kind of revolving around them. And maybe no one else even averages more than 12 points per game. But any of those guys, they all have that one bankable skill that means that maybe they get to 20, 25 points on any given night. Like Cam Johnson, maybe one night he hits 6 threes. Mikhail Bridges, one night he cuts his way to 20 points. And there's just a lot of guys on this team now where even if they're not necessarily creating a ton of offense for themselves off the dribble, when you put them around Chris Paul and Devin Booker, that's what makes the offense so frightening, I think.
Yeah. It sounds like a Suns team of old, actually, when you describe it like that, Sam. But Mikal Bridges, actually, I think he led the team in true shooting percentage last year in a small role. And I think that role could increase slightly. And I think his true shooting percentage could still go up. It should be said that his 3-point shot getting better at the end of the season was not a coincidence. There was a material change in his form that allowed it to get better. Something happened at the beginning of, or in the middle of his rookie season where he developed a hitch, and through coaching and through film watching, he was able to eliminate that. So if that's gone, I think that the improvement in his shooting could be sustainable in a way that it wouldn't necessarily be if it's just he got hot towards the end of the season. I think there was a legitimate change where he got back to his college form, and that could make a big difference for him going forward.
If next season is just him on offense, maybe slightly higher volume, and he's playing like the way he did towards the end of this past year, I'll be very curious to see what extension talks look like for him, because that's like a really good player. I did my predictions for all defense this year, and he's on there for me this season. I think this is like the year that he gets in there. So
love to see it. They need to win a lot of games though. Right?
Maybe I'm too high on the Suns. Maybe I've been talking to you guys too much, but I'm like, I'm listening to you guys too much. But like, I'm super high on the Suns, and I a lot of it has to do. I like the moves that they made, sans Jalen Smith, obviously, but I just don't think the rest of the West got a lot better, and so the door's like really open for them to be, like ridiculously good. And Mikal Bridges specifically. If he's not taking shots that are available to him, like that's also why you have CP3 there, because he'll come running off the bench if he's on the bench in those moments and smack him in the face. And so that'll probably help Bridges' confidence, maybe I should say, a little bit too.
Yeah, let it fly. He needs to let it fly. And I think you're right too about, the West. I also think the Suns are a team that's going to be the team of tryhards. There's not a bunch of veterans that have been to the playoffs 10 times and don't care about home court advantage. They want to make a point. They want to make a statement this year, and they're going to keep that foot on the gas pedal as much as possible, with or without Chris Paul playing every game. I think they're just really going to push hard this season to get to win as many games as possible. Whereas like a team like the Lakers might not. Like, I don't know if they really care to.
They don't give a shit about the regular season. They're not going to care. So we've talked about like the concerns or potential concerns about how they'll handle backup 5, and then obviously the concerns at backup point guard. Is there like any element of concern when you're looking at the secondary wing rotation, unless you're just confident in Etuan Moore, or you think that Cam Johnson could play more 3? Is Abdel Nader going to get like actual minutes for this team? For some, which I actually wouldn't have a problem with, but it does still feel like they might be like one reserve wing short at the moment.
Yeah, I feel you. I mean, there was definitely a part. Look, they have one roster spot open. Actually, they still have one roster spot open because
I've labeled it the Tony Snell spot. If you guys care.
For Tony Snell, that's interesting.
I don't think he's. I forgot where he was like until last night. He's in Atlanta. I think that's going to be like an eventual buyout situation.
Huh. That's interesting. I hadn't considered that. I don't know. Do you think Nader is an interesting one? I feel like Sam and I commonly forget that Nader's on the team just because he's so deep in that rotation. But I think when you have Jay Crowder, you have Mikal Bridges, and you have Cameron Johnson, you're starting with a pretty good wing rotation already. Etuan Moore is interesting. It's, defensively, it falls off a lot after Mikal Bridges and Jay Crowder, obviously. But, I guess a lot of it depends on whether or not Jalen Smith actually earns those minutes at the 4 or the 5 coming off the bench there, because if he can play with Dario Saric, then you have Cameron Johnson playing at the 3 a little bit, and it shores that up a little bit. But I think that's a fair thing to be a little bit worried about. An injury could make a big difference as far as how it looks. I do wonder, like, we're all factoring Jay Crowder into the starting lineup mentally, but Monty Williams hasn't. I'm not really sure what that's going to be. I think it's really interesting. Could it be Cameron Johnson after what he did in the bubble? And I know that Chris Paul likes to play with players like Cameron Johnson who can shoot off movement from the top of the key. I'm just really interested to see where that falls. I'd be surprised if Jay Crowder wasn't starting. I'll say that. But, Monty Williams hasn't said that yet, so we're still waiting to see.
I'd be terrified to have him in like second units just because that probably increases the time where he's not playing with Booker or CP3 and he fancies himself a creator at points and it never ends well. So I'd be absolutely terrified if that happened. But I mean that's also fair to say.
With regard to Nader, it's just like I'm okay if he plays a few minutes just for the record. But man, it really does. It does make you think Devin Vassell would look really good in that spot right now, right? Just as
you're coming around.
Insurance. No, I mean it's not that I hate. It's not that I hate the Jalen Smith pick. It's just that I'm not a draft guy. Mike isn't a draft guy. Like we're the type of guys who kind of show up late to the whole process. And Devin Vassell was one of the guys that I really locked in on pre-draft of just like this is a guy that I actually want. And you spend a couple months and several podcasts talking about a certain player, and then he falls right into your lap, and you don't pick him. That's all it is.
Yeah, I mean, look, this is the disclaimer. I'm in the same camp as you guys. Like, I don't cover these guys until they get to the NBA, so I get like shin deep in draft coverage when it rolls around. But Devin Vassell was someone one of my colleagues turned me on to early, and just looking at like his defense, and then I think there's more ball skills there than people are giving him credit for. So he would have been a perfect fit. But look, I won't continue crapping on the Jalen Smith pick. If it helps, if Suns fans want to feel good about this, I crapped all over the Kawhi Leonard pick, like trade for the Spurs. And that seemed to turn out pretty well for them.
Yeah. I mean, Devin Vassell on the Spurs now, too. That's a pretty good situation for him, I'd say.
Oh, that all of a sudden the Spurs go from like never having wings to now they have all of them. That's quite the quite the about face for them. One of the questions I have, will we see like any material differences in how the Suns play this year because of CP3? The thing that I mentioned to you guys, like just I would assume they'll play a little bit slower, even though they like weren't that fast to begin with. But CP3 just, even though he can do stuff or like help get you out in transition, he's the type of player with Devin Booker where you want to let him get into his own offense. And so to slow things down kind of makes sense. But also they have like these combination of units where CP3 might not be on the floor, where it feels like they could play at a heart attack pace. So are they like going to be one of the better shapeshifters in the league this year? Do we just really not see a huge change in what they're doing? Will there be more threes taken? Because I would hazard, 20th and 3-point attempt rate is too low, even though you are adding another guy with a great in-between game.
Yeah, the 3-point shooting, I could basically guarantee that they're going to shoot more threes. We joked about it last time you and I talked, Dan. James Jones likes shooters because he was one. And I think he just wants them to shoot more threes. It's just they didn't have guys that were fully capable of that, as many guys that were fully capable of it. They had shooters that could shoot them. But I think you're right. I think slowing down a little bit when Chris Paul's on the floor and shooting more threes are the biggest changes that I could see. I do think they're, defensively, I think they're going to be a little bit more aggressive with Chris Paul. Like the starting lineup, I know we're probably going to get to defense at some point in this conversation, but the starting lineup of Chris Paul, Devin Booker, Mikhail Bridges, Jay Crowder, Deandre Ayton, there's only one bad defender in that starting lineup, and there are multiple guys who can get on the other team's nerves in that starting lineup, which I just find pretty fascinating. But if we're speaking offensively, I think you're right. I think slowing down a little bit, but to your point, like when Cameron Payne's on the floor, if Cameron Payne, Mikal Bridges, and Devin Booker are on the floor together, they should be running. Like they should be playing as fast as possible. It's Cameron Payne has sort of an Ish Smith vibe to what he can do offensively with that team. And if that's something that they want to do, I hope they do that, because Mikal Bridges is super effective in transition. Devin Booker, one of the best in the league in transition. No Kelly Oubre anymore, who was like one of our main transition threats. But if Cameron Johnson wants to launch 4 threes a game in transition, I'm also okay with that. So like that, those are things that I think they could do. I don't know, Sam, what do you think?
Yeah, no, I agree with you. Look, I think overall they are going to be slower. They are going to play a little bit more ISO just because it plays to the strengths of Paul and Booker, but they're not going to take away, I hope, too much from what made them so successful last year, which is playing that up-tempo, free-flowing system. Slightly up tempo, as Dan said, not like super up tempo. Dan, did you ask about Ayton's threes in that question? I already forgot.
I didn't even get to it, but it was just, I was wondering if his 3-point, I know he upped it a little bit towards the end of the season, but like, is he gonna does he have to take threes now? Like, could he even be a pick and pop option for them maybe?
Yeah, it's a really interesting question. It's something I've thought about too, and I think we discussed it just recently on our podcast. Like, personally, I want Deandre Ayton. I love the stuff in the bubble. I want Deandre Ayton to build on his 3-point volume, but only to the point of keeping the defense honest with what they do this year. Like, I think this is a team that has a lot of high quality shooters, but isn't necessarily going to be a super high volume 3-point shooting team. Maybe a little bit more than last year, but not in the top 5 or anything. Structurally with Deandre Ayton, I think a 4-out offense with one elite lob threat is going to be a lot more successful than a 5-out offense where your 5 is shooting like 31-32% from 3, you know, like he's just a lot more valuable in the dunker position. So, you know, I hope he gets his feet wet with that, maybe takes one more attempt per game or something like that. But I don't think that increase specifically related to Deandre is going to be super significant.
Do you guys have any feel for you, and Mike kind of touched upon this, for where this team ends up defensively? Because I feel like they can cobble together some, and we're presuming they're starting 5, like that should be the strongest defensive unit that they have, unless you know you're going to sub out Devin Booker and just throw Javon Carter in there. Like, then that becomes like just a 5-man terrorizing unit. But overall, like, do you think that this ends up being a better than average defensive team? I feel like they're still going to be aggressive, so maybe their foul rate doesn't get cut down a ton, and it feels like maybe CP3 will help them be more disciplined when they're defending in transition. But do you see that being much better this season, or is there still going to be like a touch and go element or more painful elements on that end of the floor?
I started off this offseason, once things kind of shook out, thinking that it would be closer to an average defensive team. But the more I've thought about it, the more I've talked myself into it being a better than average defensive team, which I think starts to raise the overall ceiling of this team if you're talking about where they fall in terms of the entire league. But look, you talked about him. You know, I love him. Mikhail Bridges could be one of the best wing defenders in the NBA this season. That makes a huge difference. Chris Paul is better than Ricky Rubio. For as good as Ricky Rubio was defensively, we're going to factor in an improvement for Deandre Ayton. And then, of course, you know, for as good as Kelly Oubre was at a lot of things for the Suns, he actually was an overrated defender. He's never really had a positive defensive BPM, for example. It's just not.
Kelly Oubre is gone for 1 month, and Suns fans just proceed to stomp on his dead body. No, it's funny because Kelly Oubre brought such a cultural significance to the Suns that like people were obsessed with him, to the point where I feel like a lot of Suns fans who actually weren't super into kind of what he's all about, at least on the court, were afraid to air any of their grievances. And now that he's finally gone, they're all there with it.
He should still be allowed to be on the payroll as like a brand ambassador for them. He can play for another team, but should still have to be like a Suns brand ambassador.
Yeah, I like that, like the Drake role. But I think, you know, I've been consistent on that. I just think he's been an overrated defender just in general. Whereas Jay Crowder, maybe even a little overrated too with Jay Crowder, but also much, much better than Kelly Oubre. But it gets a little rocky when you go from that starting lineup to the bench. Outside of Javon Carter, there's no excellent defenders. It's mostly filled with, you know, guys who are going to launch a lot of threes, and you know, Dario Saric, we're talking about him at the 5, not perfectly suited for that, but not terrible either. So I've sort of talked myself into there's potential there for them to crack that top 10 defense. And if they do that, they could be a really excellent team. It's just about, I think, staying healthy for a lot of these guys, because Mikal Bridges, who has not missed a game yet in the NBA, has to continue to do that. Jay Crowder, you know, is one of the older guys. And then, of course, Chris Paul. But if we're factoring in, you know, we're talking about last season, they sort of below average, slightly below average defense. You know, 25 games missed with Deandre Ayton made a big difference there. If he played those 25 games, I think that number would look closer to average. Now we're factoring in a couple other great defenders on that team. I think they could get better than that.
It feels like the way they cobble together their like non-starting lineup units will determine like kind of where they land defensively. And I think inherently, like, while Saric at the 5 is the smartest move, that's probably just where you're taking like the biggest gamble, because he might be fine there, but how do you flesh out like those units around him, even if you're, you know, mixing and matching starters and reserves?
While I was looking up stuff for this pod, though, I did notice that it's a small-ish sample size, 500 plus possessions. They were in the 56th percentile of defensive efficiency for Saric at the 5 units. And it's an even smaller sample, but when Saric was at the 5 with Javon Carter on the court, they were in the 79th percentile of defensive efficiency. Their half-court defense was just off the charts in those minutes. So maybe there's a blueprint there, but I think that ultimately, if the starting lineup is what we think it is, or even if it's Cam Johnson instead of Jay Crowder, I think it ends up being like the reserves that determine the tenor of the defense when we're looking at where they rank amongst other teams. So this is a boring question, I feel like, which is why I have a more creative follow-up. But like, is the closing unit what should be their most common closing unit? Because it will be, I'm sure, matchup based to some extent. Is it just what we think the starting lineup is going to be? It's CP3, Booker, Jay Crowder, Mikal Bridges, and Ayton, or do you see like any changes being made there?
Well, I think that's a very good closing lineup, and I think kind of it touches on what the previous question was, is just Jay Crowder. Like, last year, the Suns had a great defender in Mikal Bridges. What they would do is they would unleash Mikal Bridges on perimeter players, like anyone from Damian Lillard to James Harden to Luka Doncic. But when you were playing those larger forwards, this is kind of where Kelly Oubre came up short. And so Jay Crowder is going to play a really pivotal role. He's got a 15-pound advantage on Kelly Oubre in terms of weight. Just when it comes to like this is the reason I really like Jeremy Grant as a free agent option too. I didn't like him for $20 million. But so it's why I was willing to settle for Jay Crowder. But just his defensive toughness is something that he's going to provide in closing roles. However, you can easily substitute Jay Crowder for Cam Johnson. And in fact, I think that's what they're going to do closing a lot of times when they need an extra punch of offense. I just have this vision in my mind of like, either Chris Paul or Devin Booker on the ball and a Spain pick and roll with one of those guys. Deandre Ayton comes to the top of the key. He sets a screen. Cam Johnson comes to screen Deandre Ayton's man. And then you've got Cam Johnson, a movement shooter, comes out to the perimeter. You've got an elite mid-range shooter in either Chris Paul or Devin Booker. And you've got Deandre Ayton, an elite lob threat. And it's just like triple threat scoring in a single play in kind of its perfect form. So I think like the things that you can do with Cam Johnson are just so advanced on offense beyond what you can do with Jay Crowder, where you basically just stick him in a corner.
I also think to that point, as much as it pains me to say this, there's a chance that Cam Johnson's in that lineup instead of Mikal Bridges as well, depending on the defensive matchup, because of Jay Crowder's, he's thick, as we talked about earlier. Jay Crowder can guard some of the heavier forwards, or even, to some extent centers if you had to have him on those guys. So, we'll see though, because I love Mikal Bridges in these lineups no matter what. So, but I do think that Chris Paul likes playing with shooters like Cameron Johnson, and I think he's going to earn some minutes throughout the season, maybe even starting by the end of the season.
So if you had to choose between Mikal Bridges and Jay Crowder, like which one is going to be moved in and out of the crunch time lineup more, who would it be?
I'd prefer Mikal Bridges to be in that crunch time lineup more, but I think so much of that is going to depend on matchups, because if I had to choose who I want guarding like Giannis or LeBron, I'd choose Jay Crowder, because Jay Crowder is just stronger. So I think it'll just depend on matchups.
Sam, so let's start with you on this one. Is there like an offbeat lineup that you're hoping they test out at some point? This is my favorite question to ask, because I spend way too much time thinking about it.
Because think about it, like last year, it's very similar to what the lineup was last year of just like, let's go get a stop, where they would play, you could play Rubio at point guard, and then you get Javon Carter out there to just harass people on the perimeter, and Mikal Bridges is in there. Last year it would be Kelly Oubre and Deandre Ayton. This year, you just swap out Rubio for Chris Paul, and you swap out Kelly Oubre for Jay Crowder, and you just get a lot more toughness. And what you can do is it allows you to play Javon Carter while still retaining like some semblance of offensive game. So it's just like, let's get a stop. Javon Carter, Mikal Bridges, anytime those two share the court at the same time, with Deandre Ayton dropping back to protect the rim, and you got Jay Crowder in there if you got a big body that he needs to bang with in the post as well. Like it's just fun basketball. It's just like pure serotonin watching Javon Carter. Like some of Mike's all-time favorite tweets of mine are just, he'll react to plays as they happen real time during the game, and just like Javon Carter harassing people for 94 feet. It's basic fundamental stuff, but it just gets it gets you going. It really gets the juices flowing.
Any lineup with Chris Paul and Javon Carter harassing guards will be hilarious and fun to watch. In general, like if you think about, like if they're playing the Trailblazers or something, and you just put Javon Carter and Chris Paul and to chase around Damian Lillard and CJ McCollum, that's going to drive them insane.
Right.
They're gonna hate that. But beyond that, if you do the sort of point book minutes with Booker at point guard, and then you could have some combination of Mikhail Bridges, Jay Crowder, Cameron Johnson, and DeAndre Ayton as the other four, I love that idea just because you have so much switchable guys on that roster. And if you even want to kick DeAndre Ayton out of that lineup and put
Jalen Smith
at the point
right?
guard, yeah. If we're going super small here, you could have Chris Paul, Devin Booker, Mikal Bridges, Cameron Johnson, and Jay Crowder at like small ball center. That's super exciting to me too, just to see. I don't know how often they're going to do something like that. Maybe DeAndre Ayton's in foul trouble or something, or they just have a team that they want to go really small against and see how it works. Those types of lineups are pretty exciting for me too. They have three wings that could play together on the floor with Devin Booker, and it could be really interesting to see that.
Could have been 4 if they had Devin Vassell, just saying.
Yeah, well, that would be bizarre.
My pick for them was the closest to your latter one, where it didn't include Booker, Chris Paul, Javon Carter, Mikal Bridges, Jay Crowder, and I got really weird and said Cam Johnson at the 5 there. I'd be interested to see if we think that Dario Saric is the backup 5. Maybe it's more realistic to plug him in there, where it's a matter of, oh hey, Javon Carter comes in with Dario Saric, and you're just you're pulling Ayton and Devin Booker, and they're going to get minutes together. But I love just 5-out lineups and going super small, and I like the idea of Dario Saric is going to hold up better defensively, I think, at the 5, but just because of Cam Johnson's shooting and then like not really needing to have the ball ever or having the desire to be like inside the arc ever, just surrounding that with Chris Paul and then having 4 guys who are legitimately going to be in everyone else's jerseys in Crowder, Bridges, Carter, and Paul. And like, honestly, I don't care who the 5th is if those 4 guys can just get plenty of minutes together.
Dan, I have to say, I look forward to the end of the season when you're saying that 5th should be Jalen Smith, because you realize how much that Chris Paul loves to have an actual lob threat on the floor with him, and there's none.
I'll advocate for Damian Jones then instead of Jalen Smith at that point. So tying this all together, what's a realistic win total? And you could do it on an 82-game season because I have a conversion set up because I can't even put anything into context of 72 games. What's a realistic win total? And then also just Western Conference standings finish for this squad?
Oh, that's tough. Sam, do you want to go first on that one?
Well, it's funny because their over-under is 38.5, and I feel like if I'm being objective, I have to like be close to that. But I think that's low.
That's a 44 win pace for an 82 game season.
44 win pace for a Chris Paul team. I just don't see it, frankly. Like if they had just gotten Chris Paul and then they didn't go out and do the other stuff like the Jay Crowder signing and they kind of botched free agency, I could see that. But I don't know. I think the complementary pieces around Chris Paul are good enough on this team that like they can get to 42, 43, 44 wins. What is that? Like close to a 50 win pace in a normal season?
So you said, let's just go with 42. That's 48. That doesn't seem astronomical.
It's exactly where I think it should be.
That doesn't seem astronomical at all.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I think they could be better. Like, I think it still could get better than, like, while we're on this podcast, some news broke about James Harden not showing up to practice too with the Rockets. And so if James Harden is moved, the West gets a little bit easier. Each time the West gets a little bit easier, I think about the Suns potentially moving up in those standings a little bit too. And at first I thought if we're on an 82 game season, somewhere like 48 to 50 is where I would initially guess, which like you said is like 42, 43 wins in this weird 72 game season. But in most ways, I look at this team as better than OKC, just because nobody at Devin Booker's level.
Just as a note, I love that OKC like spotted the market inefficiency in the West where it was, oh, everyone's trying to make the playoffs or play in. Like, you know what? Fuck it. We'll just steer out of it.
And I think some other teams will do that too. Like, I think if Sacramento, if it doesn't go super well at first, they're going to say, all right, this draft is too good. Let's pivot in the middle of the season. I think there's a chance that other teams might do that too. If New Orleans, if Zion misses some time, they might pivot at some point, and all of a sudden guys
Not with their 14 national TV games.
Yeah. You know, all of a sudden Steven Adams' ankle is a little sore. I don't know if you can keep that guy off the court, but, you know, I do think that the draft is so good. There are going to be teams that pivot towards being okay with losing more games this season rather than what we expected, which was every team wants to make the playoffs right now. Maybe Houston's one of those teams, maybe New Orleans, maybe Sacramento. I don't know about Minnesota, maybe Minnesota. Who knows what they're going to look like? But I think the Suns could be better than people expect. It's just difficult. It's difficult to predict any win total in this specific season confidently because, first of all, we haven't even seen the entire schedule. We don't even know what the second half of the season is going to be. We don't know how much COVID is going to affect the overall win totals. But if we take all of that out, we're thinking about it in a vacuum. I think that they should be at about a 50-win pace, which for non-Suns fans listening to this that think I'm insane, that's fair. Like, we want to see it happen before we actually say this, but just from a completely objective standpoint, looking at the team and looking at what I think they should be, I would say they should be close to that 50 win rate on a normal 82-game season.
Non-Suns fans are not going to like what I have to say then. So I have them at 46-47 this year, which is 52-54 win pace. And my justification there is thus. I think Mike laid out a lot of my argument. I think they're going to care about games in the regular season more than a lot of the other teams, even if they put Chris Paul in some sort of maintenance program. And just like Devin Booker, Ayton, Mikal Bridges, these guys are all young. And so, like, who are you really trying to rest? And you want to make the playoffs because Robert Sarver opened his piggy bank for Chris Paul. Like, that's going to be like, maybe Chris Paul doesn't even get rest because they're so concerned with making the playoffs. The other thing is Oklahoma City played at a 50-win pace this past year while not really leaning on Chris Paul like so heavily. They were terrible without him on the court, but like he didn't play as many minutes as you think. And so part of that might have just been they were unreal in crunch time. But I look at the non-Chris Paul pieces on this Suns roster, and in the aggregate, well, one, Devin Booker is better than any number two that OKC had last year. Like Shai Gilgeous-Alexander, even if for some reason you're higher on his future than Devin Booker, he's just not the creator for everyone else that Booker is. But just in sum, the talent is better after Chris Paul than that OKC team. And so when I look at that and combine it with that, I don't think a ton of the teams, like I've sort of boiled it down to when I'm talking about a lot of teams as ceiling, I think one of the Clippers or the Lakers will end up being in front of, you could say, let's use the Suns for this instance. And then like one of the Blazers and Nuggets and Jazz are like right there. So like those are two teams out of those five where I'm like, okay, they're definitely going to be in front of these teams. So like for a team like Phoenix, I'm like, I don't think third, fourth, fifth out of the West is like, that's not a huge leap. And if they're going to play at a 52-win pace this year, maybe I'm going too high. Perhaps they'll play Jalen Smith more than I thought, and I'll lower this to like a 36-win pace or something like that.
No, I actually think that's a fair thing to say. And part of it is like the Warriors won't be as good as we thought they were going to be because no Klay Thompson. So if you're looking at just the standings alone, maybe it won't take as many wins as we expect to make it to like that third seed. That could be it too. But just from a wins perspective, like this team should be good. They should be really good.
You know, Dan, we were just debating on our podcast yesterday. If the Suns do finish somewhere in the vicinity of like third to sixth, do you think there's a team like, because obviously they want to win, they talk about winning a championship, but we're mostly just concerned with getting out of the first round first. Do you think there's a team in that range that is either like a really good or a really bad matchup for Phoenix in a first round series?
I would not want to see them have to go up against the Clippers. That's the team that's like, I guess we all overrated them this past season, but like, I don't think they match up particularly well with the Clippers. And so that's the team, I think, even more so than the Lakers for the Suns that you want to avoid in the first round, because like they actually have people they can throw at both Chris Paul and Devin Booker at the same time. And like the Lakers can't say that. I think when you're looking at the Lakers, like kind of wing defense at this point, you lose Danny Green, who defended a lot of point guards. Wes Matthews is like fine. He can handle some of the bigger wings, but like, I don't know that like how well he matches up with, you have to pick, like you have Wes Matthews to throw at CP3 or Devin Booker and then no one to throw at the other one. So
I just want to say real quick, Devin Booker murders Wes Matthews, absolutely kills him.
Well,
there are multiple game winners on the record over Wes Matthews by Devin Booker.
Just after watching Wes Matthews defend Jimmy Butler for as long as Mike Budenholzer actually allowed him to in the playoffs, it should have been longer. I don't think I would prefer for the Suns. I don't want to face the Clippers. Like, and I think they actually match up kind of well with the Nuggets. Especially like when you look at the Nuggets wing rotation now, it's so bare bones. They lost I would say two of their three best wing defenders. You have Gary Harris, Torrey Craig, and Jeremy Grant, and now they're both gone. Two of those guys are gone. So having Ayton go up against
Jokic has killed Ayton historically, but
I will say,
go ahead.
Ayton had a 24-point quarter against the Nuggets as well. So it goes both ways. on that team, they both kind of just beat up on each other a little bit. And, I would count on more of a defensive improvement from Ayton than Jokic, but Jokic will still probably kill that. Yeah. That's a tough matchup for the Suns in the past, but I think with Chris Paul, it could change a little bit.
The Clippers are the only team where there will obviously be other preferences. I don't think you want to face LeBron at all in the playoffs, but do you guys spot any other team that's like a truly bad matchup for the Suns as currently constructed? My second pick would actually be if Golden State gets into the playoffs, just keep me away from postseason Steph and Dre. That's just the matchup you don't want.
Yeah. I think Portland is kind of scary, low key. I think yesterday when we were talking about it, we settled on Utah as like the team that we want. Like if there's any team we feel confident. Yeah, if there's any team we feel confident about in a first round matchup, give us the Jazz, which maybe is going to backfire on me 12 months.
I also wanted Houston when I thought they would be making the playoffs with James Harden, because I love the idea of Chris Paul versus James Harden in a rematch, but without any other sort of star on that team. So I don't know. Those are the two teams that I felt comfortable with. I will say, like, Devin Booker's not afraid of the Clippers in any way, and he's obviously had that game winner in the bubble, but he's had some interesting shots against that team in general. They started the season with an impressive win over them last season as well. But yeah, I think you're right. When you talk about playoffs, everything changes and the game slows down even more, and that's probably one of the worst matchups. I'm still personally afraid of the Lakers in a lot of ways. Just the size becomes difficult to defend in a lot of ways. So those are the two teams.
That's why you have Jalen Smith, so that you can go do a bigs up front. Is there anything that I missed or that we didn't talk about, or something that's still undercovered about this team that you guys would like to discuss quickly before we wrap this up?
The only thing I would reemphasize, I think we did a great job basically covering all the bases. Thank you very much for having us on, Dan. I would just reemphasize that James Jones is an enigma, even to those of us who cover the team on a weekly basis. And so come trade deadline, like, this team on paper doesn't seem to have many tradable contracts, but you just never know. And depending on what sort of position they're in the standings and how much more of a leap they feel they can make, I would just say anything is possible.
Well, the money that they can move is I guess you can combine, once they're eligible to be traded, Saric and Crowder to really get like a bigger number, but Ayton's $10 million salary is going to be huge in any trade discussions unless they're just absolutely obliterating every single piece of depth that they have right now.
Yeah, I think it's maybe closer to 11 million almost this year. Not that makes a massive difference, but yeah, I also agree with that. I think it's going to be an interesting season for him, and I don't think he'll be afraid to pull the trigger on something. But I also think there's a chance they're just playing really well, and you just keep it rolling by the time that comes. And I'd like that more. Because that flexibility is interesting too going forward. I also think, for the record, Chris Paul is going to make a difference, and just them being good is going to make a difference for the refs. We talked about this when we recorded yesterday as well. Getting the whistle a little more will help this team a lot going forward, whether that be Chris Paul or maybe Deandre Ayton a little bit. And I think those types of things, they may not stand out at first, but a few extra free throws for Devin Booker every game could get him closer to 30 points per game. And, maybe if they're in the top of the standings, if they're the 3 seed and Devin Booker's averaging 30 points per game, then you start to talk about him getting MVP votes, maybe top 5 MVP votes. And that's pretty good for this team going forward. But I think there's going to be little things like that make a big difference this season as well.
I will say they have like a team of facial expression all-stars now, just between Jay Crowder, Chris Paul, and you could throw Javon Carter in there, I think, too.
And even Booker.
Yeah, there you go. Guys, thank you so much for giving me so much of your time. This was great. The Suns are going to be a super interesting team this year. If you're not following these guys who host the Timeline podcast on Blue Wire Podcast Network, do so immediately. You can find Mike Vigil at Protected Pick, spelled exactly as it sounds, on Twitter, and Sam Cooper on Twitter is at @SCooperHoops, also spelled exactly as it sounds there. Guys, thank you so much once again for coming on, and I think, as you know by this point, you can definitely rest assured that I'll be pestering you again in the future.
Thanks, Dan.
Thank you, Dan.